part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Hi, everyone. What's good? Thanks for stopping by, and welcome to Sabol Brothers on the Baseline Podcast, all part of the Press Play Podcast Network. We're your hosts, John Sabol.
And I'm Scott Sabol.
Thanks for tuning in. Remember, you can follow us on the pod at Sabol Brothers on Twitter. You can follow me at John_Sabol.
And you can follow me at Scott Sabol Fox 8. That's my name, Scott Sabol, and then FOX, the number 8.
And we've got a lot to talk to today in this episode. Yes. And if you haven't already, subscribe on Apple and Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts as we start to move on into the beginning of football season with training camp here in a few weeks. And Scott, it's an appropriate time to talk football because we have someone here today that is no stranger to football.
Yes, absolutely. And when you hear some of the stories here, it's going to bring you way, way back, decades and decades, talking about the NFL, maybe before you were born, or maybe in the early days of the Browns, or my early days of the Browns, which would be the 1970s, 80s, and early 90s. And then we're going to take you right back up to the present. John, I know that was kind of a general introduction, but why don't you take it from there?
Our guest today is no stranger to the NFL. He's been an NFL agent for 55 years. He's represented 46 first-round draft picks in that span, in addition to hundreds and hundreds of more players. He was the agent for 3 Hall of Famers, Eric Dickerson, Randall McDaniel, and later, next month, down in Canton, his 3rd Hall of Famer will go into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and Tony Baselli. Our guest has also represented 3 number overall draft picks in his years: George Rogers in 1981, Irving Fryer in 1984, and Baker Mayfield in 2018. Yes, you heard correctly. Our guest today is Baker Mayfield's agent and a legendary NFL agent at that. Jack Mills joins us today. And Jack, thank you so much for coming on our Sabol Brothers and the Baseline Podcast. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Thanks.
Jack, before we get into Baker Mayfield, because I know a lot of our Browns listeners would love to talk about that. It's still a topic of discussion here in Cleveland, even though he's no longer a Brown, he's now a Panther. Scott and I want to go way back. We want to start the beginning of your illustrious career. Your first year as an NFL agent, you and I were talking yesterday, was 1967. A lot has changed since then. But first off, how did you get into this crazy NFL agent business?
Well, it wasn't by design, because in those days, there was very little representation going on, and there was very little money being made by the players. So there was not a large incentive to be a sports agent. But I got connected basically when I went to the University of Oklahoma, where I graduated from business school and law school. I had been a good player in Texas, a quarterback of a state championship team, but I was an OU scholarship quality player. But they had recruited some players, a couple of players from my high school, and I'd gotten to know some of the assistant coaches. And when I got on campus, they said, "Hey, Jack, why don't you come over and help us with recruiting?" Because I was from West Texas, and that's where there's fertile ground for football players and lots of OU alumni out there. I always say, where you find oil, you find OU alumni. And that's certainly the case in West Texas. But anyway, to make a long story short, I worked several years as a student doing what today would be pretty much like a recruiting coordinator. You know, we didn't have computers. It was mostly done reading newspapers and that sort of thing, talking to coaches, getting and referral from other players and all that. And that was in the days of the legendary coach Bud Wilkinson, who was still today, you know, one of the all-time greats in college football coaching. Anyway, after I went into the military for 2 years after law school. And when I got out of the military, Eddie Crowder, who'd been an assistant coach at Oklahoma, had become the head coach at Colorado. And he had also become the AD, which was fairly common in those days. And so he contacted me and said, "Why don't you come here and be my assistant AD?" And we had no other plans really about where to go. And so we came to Boulder, Colorado, and I worked for Eddie for 1 year. And got to know a lot of people doing that. Working, I was, being assistant AD, and I got to know a lot of the football players here. And of course, I had all my ties at Oklahoma, but I went with a law firm in Boulder, and just as part of my law practice, I started to represent players. And that was really about the only way you could do it economically, because there was really, in those days, there was no governance of the agent representation business. It was just get what you can. A lot of guys charge 10%. Some people probably charge more, but there was no regulation the way there is today. And so I just gradually over the years built up a pretty big practice of representing players. And I had Hale Irwin, a legendary pro golfer who won 3 U.S. Opens and Golf Hall of Fame, and 45 wins on the senior tour. Anyway, so I just tried to work the contacts that I had here at CU and at OU, and, word spread, and I got a lot of referrals from other players until I think about 93, when we finally got free agency in the NFL. It got to be a lot better for the players, and I could actually make a living doing just the representation. So that's a kind of a condensed version of how I got to where I am today.
So so basically from 1967 to 93, being an agent, wasn't what people think of being a sports agent is today. I mean, you had, many, many decades, and then free agency came in. I'm sure that was pretty difficult considering the salaries, the NFL salaries hadn't ballooned like they have today.
No, and really and truly, the only leverage you had in negotiations was holdouts. A guy could just not come to training camp or not sign after he's drafted, which is, a very inefficient way of negotiating. But without free agency, I mean, you could become a free agent, but we had in those days, we had what was called the Rozelle rule. And that said that if a team signed another team's free agent, that Pete Rozelle, the commissioner, would determine the compensation. And it was usually punitive. It was usually more than they could have negotiated in a trade. So consequently, very few players changed teams in free agency in those days.
Wow.
But when we finally got free agency, the big trade-off was the owners got a salary cap and the players got free agency. And about that same time, the TV money started increasing rapidly, and therefore everything was going up once we got to that point.
Very similar to what happened in baseball back in the mid 70s when you had Curt Flood and then you had free agency there. And then in the 1980s, early 90s, same type of progression, but baseball happened a little bit earlier. Right. What was the average salary of a player back in the 60s, mid-late 60s?
Well, I'll give you an example. In 1970, I had 4 number 1 draft choices. And one of them was Steve Owens from Oklahoma, the Heisman Trophy winner that year in 69. And Steve Sabol with Philadelphia Eagles, tight end. He was like the 6th pick in the first round. Bobby Anderson from Colorado, running back. And a linebacker from Oklahoma named Jimmy Files. Anyway, all of the starting salaries were $25,000.
Wow.
The bonuses were like $40,000. This is first round.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and that was first. So like I had Dick Anderson, who became a MVP defensive player in the NFL with the Dolphins. He and Jake Scott, I had both of those guys. And when I think Dick was drafted in the 3rd round and his starting salary was like 15. I mean, it was just, wow. It really, you look back on it, and even though money was, I mean, in today's dollars, it's more than that. But still, for considering the physical damage of the sport, it wasn't a lot of money.
Wow, that's crazy when you really put all that in perspective, Jack. And that was just incredible considering look at the NFL now. You can see how all the limitations they have on practices. The equipment obviously has changed and everything. Yep. So guys were getting beat up for very little money back in those days.
It was really funny because they would basically shut down the operation after the last game. You think about today, the training room of an NFL team is never locked. The door is never locked to my knowledge. It's they're open 365. In those days, they locked up the doors. The trainer usually lived somewhere else, and he would go home, and then they would all come back at training camp, and they used training camp to get in shape. Now with all the, off-season workouts and mini camps and OTAs and everything, there's rarely off season.
Yeah, that's very true. Back then, how did you go about, and even today, going out and trying to pick a player that you'd want to represent? What did you look for, and what do you still look for in a young client?
Well, the first thing, you want a player that can play, that can make it, because you only get paid if your player gets paid. So as much as you like to help people that are, want to do it and are trying so hard to do it, you can't afford to spend too much time on that because it doesn't make economic sense. So the first thing is you want players that are rated to make it. And then I'd say, secondly, we want good character people. And thirdly, we want people that we can establish a good rapport with and become friends with, because in many cases, you become that player's most trusted advisor. And so you want that level of trust, and you just want to be friends. You want to get along, and you want to, sometimes you end up being a godparent to a child, or in a person's wedding. It becomes a very personal relationship if it's done properly. So we really we try to get referrals, find out ask a lot of questions of scouts and coaches and other players, and look at the rating services to find out who are in fact the really good players, who the people that we should be spending time on. And there's a lot of misses, just like there is in the draft. Mm-hmm. You're not right all the time, but sometimes you get undrafted players that are good. We had Rod Smith with the Broncos, who, in my opinion, should be in the Hall of Fame. Mm-hmm. He was an undrafted guy, and became a great player. So, and we've had others too, but you'd rather get first and second rounders than free agents, but sometimes the free agents work out.
So what kind of challenges do you face in today's NFL? Nowadays you have the huge endorsements, the huge contracts, or just tons more money, like we talked about earlier. What type of challenges do you face, and how do those variables impact your job and the relationship with a player versus, say, 25, 30 years ago, or even before free agency?
Well, let's see if I understand that.
In other words, the more money you have, it seems like that could complicate things. So
it's a good point, Scott. I do think that. Well, I remember Bill Belichick was, to quote him, at one point he said, "There's two things we can't evaluate, and one is time, and the other is money." Because these players, as college players, they've had every minute of their day planned for them at colleges, even in the summer now. These guys are used to, they got summer jobs. Now they're on campus all summer, working out, going to class. They don't have a chance to get a summer job, but now they've got all this other stuff that the NIL and everything. But, and so that one is time and the other is money, because they've never had any money. What are they going to do? And if you give a player a large signing bonus, does he still have incentive to play? It's really, I think that's something that presents a lot of difficulty for scouts and coaches. The more power the players get, the more difficult they can be. But I don't know. I just think it has changed so much in that respect, because guys used to go back to school in the off season. They used to have summer jobs. They'd go back and work in the off season, so that they had a job waiting for them when they got out of playing. And now it's pretty much even impossible to do it because of all the demands that are put on them in the off season. I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Does.
Jack, your son Tom is a partner with your firm. He's been an NFL agent, I think, from our conversations, I think from the 80s. Your guys' firm isn't one of the biggest or most popular firms in the NFL because there's just so many agencies out there. But yet you've signed some big name agents, including Baker Mayfield. So if you're a college kid coming out, what kind of services do you and Tom offer that you may or may not get from some of those bigger NFL agency firms?
Yeah. Well, I think the big difference can be, it doesn't necessarily have to be, but it can be just the personal level of attention that you're going to get from a smaller agency. And some players really don't care. Some players don't necessarily want that personal attention. But I think that's the big difference. Everybody provides personal training. There's what they call, the draft preparation. Mm-hmm. That the first thing the players want to know about when you're talking to them for representation is, where they're going to train. It's become popular to, provide some kind of a stipend. And quite frankly, the bigger agencies can outspend us pretty quickly if it becomes some people offer marketing guarantees. They'll give them a big upfront amount of money against a marketing guarantee. I don't know. There's just, I don't know. I just think there's more personal attention for sure. But it's, the big agency will probably do a good job of negotiating the contract. But first of all, now with the rookies, if you probably know, with the draft, we don't have any leverage at all on the numbers. The numbers are absolutely preset. And you may argue about a clause or two about offset if the player's got a guarantee and he goes somewhere else, says you have to offset that money against the first team's guarantee, that sort of thing. Your real negotiating skill and your knowledge about free agency really comes on that second, third contracts, if the guy's lucky enough to make it to a third one. So really that first 4 years, you're basically your hands are pretty much tied on what the player's going to make.
Yeah, that rookie rate wage scale that was implemented years ago eliminated those long holdouts from players that are missing training camp, and then sometimes it even trickled into the preseason. Yeah,
which was overall it's worked pretty well. I don't think that was necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, I think it's a great thing.
Yeah, certainly players need to get in. They need to get, they need to get started on time, and usually holdouts they can create animosity with coaches and teammates, and it's better to get off to a positive start.
So what is it like working with your son? First question. And well, let me ask you this question first. How is it working with your son? And, did he take to being an agent pretty easily, or was there a steep learning curve for him? And I ask that because, dealing with, GMs and owners, that can be a daunting task at first, or did it come naturally to him?
Well, of course, he was so-called raised in the business. I mean, he heard it talked. He heard it talked his whole life, but he went to University of Kansas and the University of Kansas Law School, and he did some private law practice for, I think it was 2 or 3 years. Mm-hmm. And then he said, I really would like to come into the business. And I was very glad about that, because I got to tell you, there's a trust factor involved in hiring people to work for you. There's a lot of guys, there are some people, I should say, that are just want to learn from you and take off and try to take your clients with them. That's happened a few times. Mm-hmm. And, but of course I wasn't worried about that with Tom, but it's been great. I think we've been together 27 years now.
Wow.
And he did all of the talking on the Baker deal, and with them and the Panthers, but it's worked out really well. And we didn't want to be a great big firm, because we enjoy living where we live, and we enjoy having the flexibility that we have, and there's not a lot of pressure to produce so much money. Like you get in a law firm, they want you to bill so many hours and get so much revenue. We've always had a pretty just a trusting thing about that. I mean, if people are working hard, you don't have to worry too much about where their heart is and getting the business done.
So got one more question, a question more about the history, and then this will kind of dovetail right into the Browns and talking a little bit more about Baker Mayfield. So, John had mentioned, and you had mentioned some of the past clients, Eric Dickerson, Irvin Fryer, and of course, Baker currently. We also mentioned Tommy Vardell, who was a player back in the 90s, and Dave Logan. We forget about Dave Logan, who was on our podcast around the holidays, wide receiver for the Browns back in the early 1980s. So you're no stranger to the Browns organization. Did, your history at all, did it make it easier, or is business?
Well, I always got along well with Jim Bailey, who used to be their legal counsel. And I knew Art Modell a little bit, but most of my dealings were with Jim. And I always had a great relationship with Jim, and they always treated me well. And I had a real good experience there. Let's see, it was Terry Taylor and Joe DeLamalure, and I don't know. There were Terry. Let's see. There was five, like you mentioned, touchdown Tommy Vardell. A lot of good experiences along the way there.
Any good Art Modell stories at all, or did you not really deal with him too much? I always say that because
with him, Art was just one of those guys that if you came in, he would probably say stop by the office and say hello, and there wasn't much more to it. I didn't have we didn't go to dinner or anything, but he was always very friendly to me.
Jack, back in the 90s when Modell moved the team, was that surprising to you, knowing how Cleveland was a bedrock franchise in the NFL and knowing how much it meant to the city? And I know you didn't deal much with Art Modell, but it shocked a lot of people back then. And for you, who's got a pulse on the league and ownership and players, was it, I would imagine, surprising for you as well?
It was. I would say yes. It was a shock. It was very much like the Colts moving, when Irsay packed them up at midnight and left. And I think, wasn't it the stadium that was a big issue? Getting a new stadium, was that what it was?
Huge issue, yeah, because the stadium was falling apart. And then you had the Gateway Project, and then Art Modell wanted a new stadium, and they wouldn't play ball, and that's and they said, "Look, I got to move the team. That's the only way I can do it."
Yeah. So, and obviously today, let's face it. I mean, a 20-year-old stadium is a relic anymore. But but that old stadium was a classic. But it was part of the Browns, and it really surprised me that they're good, just because there's no fandom like the Browns. I mean, they're some of the most dedicated, loyal, rabid fans in the NFL.
Yeah, that stadium. Go ahead.
I'm sure Art needed a lot of security after that.
I think, and Scott, you may know this story better than I, but I don't think Art Modell ever stepped foot back in Cleveland after the move. Isn't that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah. No. Even when the team played there, he didn't come. And it was smart not to.
Yes. Well, you mentioned, Jack, the stadium in this day and age is a relic after 20 years. The Browns are already trying to get a new one, and that stadium was built in 99, and it was rushed, and there's some issues with it. But, we're a disposable society, I guess you could say, in that aspect of things.
Guess. Yeah, the stadium today, it's like they pretty much get it. I mean, they're even talking when Walton was buying the Broncos, they were talking about would his first priority be to get a new stadium.
Wow.
And I mean, the stadium they've got is fine, but maybe if they put a roof on one, they could get a Super Bowl. But other than that, because they don't make any sense for 10 dates a year.
Yeah, and it doesn't. And then you just maybe have a soccer game or two or a concert still. What do you at a dozen at this point, or maybe 15, so. Yeah, we'll see what happens with the Browns and their stadium quest as this decade rolls on. We'll have more with NFL agent Jack Mills right after this.
Hey everybody, it's Sam Amico from Cavs on the Break NBA podcast. Be sure to give us a listen for all your Cleveland Cavaliers recaps, analysis, breakdowns, draft talk, free agency. The list goes on and on. Give us a listen, Cavs on the Break NBA podcast.
Hey everyone, this is Mike Voorhees.
And I'm Brian Shaw. No, not the pitcher. We're the Guardians of the Land MLB podcast, formerly a Swing and a Tribe.
Don't have time to watch 162 games of baseball? We do. We have you covered with recaps of the games, stats, and analysis throughout the MLB season.
Subscribe now to Guardians of the Land and Press Play Pods for all your Cleveland sports analysis.
The R&R podcast going to be rocking and rolling with you because football season is underway. College, Ohio State, the Power Fives, the MAC, the Browns. Michael Regai, are you ready to rock and roll with some football?
Kenny, I've been ready. This is our time of year. This is what R&R is all about. We're going to be with you every week. Kenny just said it, Browns, NFL, Ohio State centric. So you got to stay with us all fall and winter long here on R&R.
That's right. The Regai and Rhoda podcast coming to you here on the Press Play Podcast Network. Subscribe now and don't miss a show.
Welcome back to Sabol Brothers on the Baseline podcast. NFL agent and Baker Mayfield's agent, Jack Mills, joins us now. Okay, Jack, let's talk a little bit about Baker Mayfield and your dealings with him over the years. You've known him since his college time at Oklahoma, actually when he left Oklahoma and then got drafted in 2018. What was your first impression of him when you and Tom met him in 2018 before the draft?
What impressed me was that he and his dad, they were very straightforward, very honest, very much to the point. We signed Baker the first time we ever met him.
Oh, wow.
But I think his dad, we had been talking to his dad, and his dad was in our corner, but we never even met Baker until I think it was about 10 days after they played Georgia in the Rose Bowl when Oklahoma lost that game. And he stayed in California, and we hadn't met him during the season or anything. We talked to the dad a few times, and when we met him, it was just like, hey, I'm ready to sign. And so, some of these players put you through quite a process in the recruiting, and, they want this and that and negotiate this and will you do that? And Baker was just like, let's do it. And he's just a very refreshing, just straightforward, honest guy.
Jack, you don't see that much anymore with players, kids these days. It's crazy to think like he committed to you right away and stuck with that commitment. Obviously you talk with his father and then, all right, let's get it done. Like that's such an old school way of doing things. Yeah,
it is. It really is. And yeah, you don't see that very often. And we've really appreciated it. And he's just been loyal to the core during this whole thing. And it just helps us to do a better job when we have the confidence of our client.
So you fast forward 3 years later to last summer. So we're going to go from 2018 to the summer of 2021. The talk in Cleveland was about Baker getting, a new contract extension. A lot of people thought he was going to get it from the Browns, but ultimately he never got that long-term extension. The Browns picked up that 5th-year option last summer, but throughout the whole process, did it surprise you that he didn't get that long-term extension after taking the Browns to the playoffs, the season before?
It did surprise me because of all the years they had gone without success. And then to have 11-5 record and win a playoff game, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to reward the guy that had helped so much in the turnaround. Mm-hmm. Because turning around a losing culture is not an easy thing. And John Dorsey had done a good job of getting some really good players around Baker. It obviously wasn't all him, but nobody goes anywhere without a quarterback. We all know that. So, I thought And like you said, Scott, they did exercise the option, but there was never a mention of an extension other than to say that he's our guy for the long term. But we never got around to hearing any numbers or getting into any negotiations.
So, of course, last season, was kind of a disappointment all around for the entire team. Baker suffered, the shoulder injury among the other injuries in week 2. Baker, like you said, he's an old school guy. He and his dad, those guys are, they don't mince words. They're tough, maybe a little bit stubborn, but, he wanted to play through the injuries. I know that was kind of his decision because he wanted to do it. But in your opinion, should he have played through those injuries? What was your recommendation to him? And was he receptive to advice from you at that point? Or did he just want to go gung-ho through the season on his own?
Well, Baker's very much of his own man as far as those kind of decisions. I personally didn't have that much to say with him. I don't know how much Tom talked to him about it, but he was determined to play, so I don't think it would have mattered. But looking back on it, it would have been better if he had gone ahead and gotten surgery when the injury occurred, because, trying to play a whole season with one arm tied to your side, I don't care what anybody says, it's not, it's for a quarterback especially, it changed his throwing motion. And, when you get sacked, you can't protect yourself. And it just made him look bad, I thought. But in spite of it, he played pretty darn well. But it wasn't what we were hoping for after that third year that went so well.
Yeah, you even though it wasn't his throwing shoulder, I mean, your mechanics, and he's got that quick, fast, almost like a violent mechanic motion, and that torque will always cause issues, even though it's not your throwing shoulder.
Right. Exactly.
We mentioned that playoff year, Jack, and which was a magical season for this team and for him. I mean, everything seemed to be going their way. That game in Pittsburgh, and they almost probably should have won that game in Kansas City in round 2. Yes. It seemed like the offense for a while there in 2020 was just clicking. Everything was working. Baker, the wide receivers, the offensive line, the running backs, Kevin Stefanski, everyone seemed to be on the same page. And then it seemed like at some point there was, I don't know, it seemed like overnight last year, the relationship between Baker and Stefanski and the offense just kind of turned 180. What do you think attributed to that? And do you think it was mostly the injury? And then what is your take on just the overall relationship between he and Coach Stefanski?
I honestly don't know that much about it. I'd be speculating. I think that was his fourth head coach in the first 2 years, and I think he was an improvement over what he had. But I honestly don't know what if there was a problem, what that problem might have been. I don't know what was going on with that.
Continuity is everything, and when you have 4 head coaches come in, not to mention offensive coordinators and systems, I don't care who you are, that's going to play a role into some type of dysfunction or some type of inconsistent play. And that is the big thing that has just, I think, had hurt Baker. It was totally out of his control. And then, hurt your development going up in there. And because there was a dysfunction there before he got there, as we all know, well documented, like you said. And then you just can't seem to get some consistency there. And change isn't always the best thing for coaching in the NFL, especially for a young player in a position like a quarterback.
Yeah, no, well, just look at the successful franchises and look at the turnover ratio, whether it's the Steelers or whether it's Patriots or, the successful franchises, there's very little turnover.
Was there a moment when you watched last season, Jack? Was it maybe the shoulder injury in week 2 that you knew that maybe something had changed, or was there a game, or was it the off season that you maybe had saw that the relationship between the Browns and Baker had soured or went south? Was there a moment, or was this kind of maybe a cumulative thing that started way back from the injuries and then the whole season played on?
There really wasn't, to my knowledge. I didn't really know what was going on, or or if they came to a point where they just felt like he wasn't the future, because when it was going well, they thought he was the future. And so I really don't know if there was any specific turning point that we could point to.
Did Baker ever mention anything to you throughout the season at all? Say, hey, man, something's not right here. Or was it one of those situations where he just played throughout the season and he didn't mention anything?
He didn't mention it to me.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Tom had a lot more contact with him than I did, and I don't know what they might have talked about, but I wasn't aware of anything in particular.
Mm-hmm. So the Browns publicly backed Baker through last season, like we talked about before. They said he's our guy. They signed him to the option, and then in the offseason, even during the draft and the combine in February, it seemed like everything was great. And I know you can't comment anything on Deshaun Watson, but they made that trade. And did that trade surprise you and Baker? Did you have any idea that anything like this was coming, or was it a situation where it came out of the blue and all of a sudden now you guys got to pivot?
I think that Barry may have advised Tom that they were going to see him, but up until that point, I don't think we had any indication of it. And I guess the thing that surprised me the most was when Barry said at the press conference that it had been a 5-month odyssey. That's what really shocked me, because that was contrary to what, the public statements had been and the personal statements had been about Baker.
And that would have put it at October's timeline.
Yeah, during the season. So that was, I think that surprised me as much as anything about the whole decision to go that other direction.
Well, Jack, I don't think you're the only one that was surprised. I think everyone else was surprised about it when they admitted that. To me, it sounds like when that whole thing unfolded, as an outsider, and even as members of media and as a Browns fan, looking at the entirety situation, to me, I can't help but think that they misled Baker a little bit, my opinion, the front office ownership, in terms of, how the whole thing transpired, how his ultimate exit happened, but just to the entire quest of Deshaun Watson. It sounded like to me that, especially after the public comments, that they did mislead him a little bit. My opinion. That's me saying that. Mm-hmm. Did you, Tom, or Baker get that feeling from the Browns, or were they pretty transparent to you up until the moment when they made that trek down to Houston to meet with Deshaun Watson and that whole thing?
Yeah, again, I didn't have that contact. I don't think it was that transparent up to that point. I think once they made the visit, obviously everything was out in the open, and I think there was a bit of a heads up before they went to do that meeting. And then I think that because when they came back from that meeting, it didn't sound like Watson was interested.
No, it didn't. He went 180 like 2 days later.
Yeah. And I don't know if the money went up or what happened, but something happened. I don't think I could have turned that contract down if I'd have been him. So
I don't think I could either.
So after months of Baker's career being in limbo, all this happened, during over the winter, we finally find out, and he found out that he'll be playing, as a Carolina Panther. The Browns traded him. He sounded really excited about this next opportunity on the Zoom call during the press conference. Mm-hmm. He had a lot of good things to say about Cleveland, about the fans. Where is Baker's headspace right now that we've kind of turned the page?
I think he's just all in the future now. I think he's just so relieved to have it resolved and know where he's going. He wanted to get that playbook, the day he could get it, and start talking to the coaches and start talking to some of the receivers. He had just been kind of in jail the whole off season. Mm-hmm. And that's not his style. He's always doing something with the teammates or the team. And I just think that to have it resolved was just a big weight off of him. And he just wants to look ahead. And the coach there, Matt Rule, was the coach at Baylor when when he was at Oklahoma, and really likes Baker. So, and that's not to say he's going to be handed the starting job. I don't think that's going to happen, but we'll see what happens. I think he'll be starting at some point early in the season, but that remains to be seen.
How much did he love playing in Cleveland? You know, in his years that he played in Cleveland, did you ever have conversations, or your son have conversations with him about just him enjoying himself, you know, playing in Cleveland in a big football town like that?
No, I think I didn't have that much conversation with him, but I think he really enjoyed it and really appreciated the heritage of that organization, the franchise, even though it's different than the one that left to go to Baltimore. But yeah, I think he loved being in a football town like that, and I think playing there was a great experience for him.
Well, you mentioned week one, Jack, and we'll wrap this up here with this. He's not guaranteed that starting spot. Matt Rule at that introductory press conference said, "Hey, we have an open quarterback competition here. You know, it's going to be Sam Darnold and Baker Mayfield, battling it out." You think he'll get that starting job and play week one against the Browns? I know he's chomping at the bit to do that. Who wouldn't want to face your former team?
Yeah.
But how hard is it? This is for a question that maybe the casual football fan may not realize, but you've been in the business so long and you know what players and quarterbacks have to go through. He's coming into this situation now 2 months away from week one in a new system, new players, new coaches, and a new playbook. That is quite the undertaking for anybody.
Very much. Yeah, with no off-season work at all with these guys. Yeah, I hope he's physically ready, because I don't want him to rushing back and if he's not quite ready with the shoulder. But I hope he gets to play in that game. I think that would be something he would enjoy and wanted to see his old teammates. But I don't know how to predict how that's going to unfold.
How's his rehab going with that shoulder? Pretty good.
I think it's good. I think it's as good as it needs to be or should be at this point. And he's got another about a month and a half now before the first game. But I'm sure he'll want to play some in the preseason just to get used to their system.
Yeah. He mentioned in that introductory press conference last week that he was feeling great. Shoulder feels great. And he's just excited for the opportunity. And I know a lot of the Browns fans divided. They wanted Baker to stay. Some wanted change. Who knows? But I think after that press conference, Jack, of the fans that were divided, all were in support of him just because of how well he handled himself. And Scott mentioned a second ago the compliments that he had for the city, for the fan base, and for the organization. And that's always great to see after someone that went through all of that. I mean, that's just it's easier said than done. But you got to commend him for his maturity and professionalism on that side of things.
No, he definitely took the high road on that, and I was glad he did.
Yeah. Well, Jack, Scott and I appreciate you taking the time going through your, amazing career of 55 years as an NFL agent in the business, all the players that you've had represent, giving us some insight on Baker. And also coming up here in August, you're going to get your third Hall of Famer in the Hollowed House in Canton in Tony Baselli. Yeah,
I'm excited for that. Tony's it's the sad thing about Tony is that his career was cut so short.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if he wasn't the best that ever played, I don't know, maybe Anthony Munoz was, but I mean, he was the most dominating tackle and of course I was prejudiced because I was representing him, but I mean, he put him on the ground. He didn't just block him.
Right. He was a force.
And he's a great, fine human being too. He's just a wonderful guy. I was glad to see him get it.
Jack, with all your experience going back, you need to write a book. I know that would be difficult considering you're an agent and your son is still an agent, but you should think about it, right? And just putting some of the stories down, just giving everybody just kind of an idea on everything over the last, 50 some odd years.
I wish I had taken some good notes because one of my original clients, Steve Owens, who's one of my best friends today, he said, Jack, you should write a book, but change the names to protect the guilty.
That's funny. Yeah. My goodness. Yeah. I mean, Jack, you've got to be the most experienced agent still practicing in the NFL.
Yeah, the only guy crazy enough, probably.
Are you gonna slow down? Are you gonna retire?
Well, I'm slowed
What's your
down.
plan?
I'm slowed down. I go to the office every day, but Tom does all the heavy lifting, and
You play golf.
I like to do, and go to Hawaii when it's cold here, but it's been, I couldn't have done anything that I would have enjoyed more, had more satisfaction from. I'm sure might be something I'd have made more money doing, but when it comes down to this point in your life and you look back, and if you don't have regrets, you're pretty lucky, because I'm 84.
You don't look 84.
Thanks. I don't, no one ever guesses me to be that old, but I thought I'd let you guys in on it.
I appreciate that. Jack, thank you so much for joining us. I know we took a lot of time here with you and wanted to touch on a bunch of different topics, especially, the past, because that's what we like to do here. And then, of course, talk about the present too. So, Jack, thank you so much. And don't be a stranger. Who knows? Maybe we'll have you or your son on, at some point in the future.
That'd be fun. My pleasure as well.
This has been fun, Jack. And give our best. Stay healthy too. Give our best to your son and your wife.
Okay. Thanks a lot, guys.
All right, Jack. We'll talk soon again. Take care.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
John, that was fascinating. Love hearing about the history, because we do a lot of history in the podcast. You did your due diligence here, and I didn't with looking at his former clients. I remember watching Eric Dickerson, in the 80s. And of course, Dave Logan, of course, that comes, 6 degrees of separation, or 2 degrees in this case, back to our podcast. And of course, Touchdown Tommy Vardell, back in the day. Really interesting to hear him talk about that. And really interesting to hear too, that, back in the prior to free agency in 93, and then prior to television contracts, and this goes without saying with all sports, but, all you were negotiating for was maybe a few clauses, because there was no money. And the money you were getting, I made a note here. He said back in 1970, a first rounder got 25 grand and a 40 grand signing bonus. Yeah. Even when you factor in inflation in the last 50 some years, that's still not a lot of money, considering that, as he said, they shut the doors when the season was over. They shut the doors, and you were on your own for any sort of care, any sort of rehab. And then the doors opened up the first day of training camp, which is, I found fascinating.
Yeah. And if you think about, you mentioned inflation, Scott, $20,000 in 1970 is equivalent to $152,000. Does that sound about right for inflation?
That's about right. I think so.
Yeah. I'm looking at some inflation, a calculator here online. It's just crazy to me to think about back then, in those days, when guys weren't making, what we consider now not a lot of money. Back then it would be. Things were cheaper, standard of living cheaper. But these guys, those training rooms would shut down and close, and these guys, if they needed to, would have to get a job off the street doing something very similar to how baseball players were back in like the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, and so on. Right,
exactly.
They were getting beat up. Equipment was awful. But the list of guys that he has is just impressive. 46 first-round draft picks in 5+ decades.
It is really neat too. Yeah, we talked about the Browns organization and how he didn't really deal with Art Modell too much. It was mainly through legal counsel, which is pretty common practice. And then we kind of got into Baker. And, I'll be honest, John, you could tell he was tap dancing around some questions. He was saying a lot, but he didn't really tell us anything more than we didn't already know. And I don't mean any disrespect, but you can kind of see he tap danced around some stuff, but reading between the lines, like he said, Baker's his own man. All right. We knew that already, but there was a struggle there. There was a struggle between him. There's a struggle between Stefanski that probably was brewing a lot earlier than what we all thought. We thought a lot of this occurred maybe in, I don't know, November, December. There's a good chance this occurred a lot earlier than that.
Yeah. And, agents do that though, too. I mean, you want to take the high road in a lot of things.
You do. Absolutely.
And you can say, whatever you want about what has happened in the past, we can speculate. Jack has been around the block a long time, longer than us, Scott. So he knows what he's talking about. And, there's a lot of things we'll never know about that dynamic. And, frankly, it's none of our business, but as members of the media and fans, we all want to know, but at least we got a little bit of an insight of some things. But there has been documented cases, from other players and other reports that there was a division there, a rift there between Stefanski and Mayfield. And
right.
Where that started, I guess we don't really know or how. But you got to think there was something good was there because they went to the playoffs and they played really well. Yes, Baker was healthy during that 2020 season. So if you didn't like somebody, you made it work at least for one season.
Right.
But to know exactly what happened, that's got to be more insight. Some other players that have to let us know, because I would love to know if there was that turning point. Maybe it was a cumulative thing, Scott, where you have the injury factor, or maybe you're too stubborn and you want to play, yet you're hurting your own team. Maybe
and you have a young coach.
Right. And maybe that attitude alienated himself with his teammates and players. Well, of course, we're speculating here.
We don't know. Sure.
We don't know. But I did, and I'm glad Jack did say this too, that Baker did say a lot of great things about the Browns, the city of Cleveland, and the fans. He did take the high road in that introductory press conference last week. I was on that Zoom call. He was genuine. I think this whole situation for him has kind of humbled him a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounded like that way, at least. And so it would be great, though, if he wins that starting job. Jack thinks he will. And I hope he does, because, man, that would be a great, interesting, intriguing week one matchup.
It will be. Absolutely. He's a no nonsense guy. And I'm talking about Baker Mayfield. His dad was there. He talked about his dad being, in the negotiation, with his first contract, which is kind of neat to see, because I think a lot of these, a lot of these players, they get a lot of help from family. Some of them don't, some of them do. And just no nonsense. We wish Baker all the best. But, over time, you know how it goes. Over time, stories will start to trickle out that will be verified, and we'll connect the dots. It might be years from now.
Yeah.
But we'll see what happens. I mean, I just can't believe, as we record this, the season's right around the corner. And I don't know, season's right around the corner. Week one, everyone's going to be watching.
Yeah.
But real quick here, I know I'm shifting gears, but we also talked to Jack after we ended the podcast, and he kind of messaged. He has to write a book.
Yeah,
he definitely has to write a book with all his stories. And I don't know if he could, because you got to protect people and you can't name names. But I'd love to read that book. I don't know how he could do it. It's like writing a book about television. When you work in TV, some of the stuff just kind of, if you're not in TV, or in whatever business you're in, people won't get it. But I don't know. We'll see how it works out.
Two things, Scott. One, it's interesting. It just occurred to me as we were talking to Jack about the Baker extension that he never got. That was a year ago this time. Everyone was talking last June, July of last year, before training camp started. Do you remember when we had Eric Metcalf on last summer? And, we talked to him like, do you think Baker should get an extension? What do you think they should do? And I remember he was one of the first people that said, and we have to go back, if you guys haven't listened to that podcast, go back in the archives and listen to it, because he had a lot of great Brown stories and stuff. And I remember him saying something along the lines, of course, I'm paraphrasing, that he would want to get one more year out of him because he had some reservations. And I can't remember exactly his take on that, but I remember he wanted one more year before he backs up the Brinks truck to him. And it's funny because the Browns were thinking the same thing Eric Metcalf was thinking.
Right.
Whereas Baker's camp, Jack and everyone thought they should get it now. And a lot of people also agreed with that. It's just so crazy in 1 year how much all this has changed.
All that has changed. Complete flip. So
yeah. But Jack, his stories, his history, he is a legend in the NFL. A treat for us to get him on here to talk about his life. And of course with his son. You don't see very many.
We can talk with his son too, because his son seems to be, the guy who's going to kind of, take the reins. Already doing a lot of the grunt work, so to speak, as Jack, as he said, he likes to play golf. Hey, I don't blame him doing this for so long. Well, we want to thank Jack Mills for being on the podcast here. A lot of great stories. You can listen to the entire podcast, all of it right here on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify. If you're at your PC and you're at work, go to Press Play Podcasts. Don't forget to hit subscribe. You can follow me, Scott Sabol, on Twitter, Scott Sabol, FOX, the number 8.
You can follow the pod at Sabol Brothers, and you can also follow me at John_Sabol. And, Scott mentioned the PC route. If you wanted to throw it in your browser, it's pressplaypodcasts.com. And just click Sabol Brothers on the Baseline Podcast logo on the screen.
There you go. On behalf of John Sabol and myself, thank you very much for joining us, everybody, and we will talk to you soon.